Thank you everyone for coming, and I imagine we'll have more people joining as we proceed. My name is Cynthia Fuchs, and I am the director of the Visiting Filmmakers series at George Mason, and I'll say a little bit about that in a second. I will warn you ahead of time, I have a puppy who occasionally enters the room barking, and I will try to mute as soon as I hear that. I also want to point out that there's a possibility for chat as you're watching and listening to this, and you can put your questions in there, and it's one way for us to see your question, and that's if you float your cursor on the bottom of the screen. The chat should show up. It's like a little bubble, like a talk bubble. The other thing that you can do is raise your hand. If you put your cursor over your name, you'll see that there's a video icon and there's a sound icon. And to the left of the video icon is a raise your hand. And so we can see you there, and we could probably actually have you speak to Jennifer when we call on you. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to say a couple words about the Visiting Filmmaker series, and then I'm going to introduce Jennifer and ask her a couple questions to warm us up. And then I'm hoping that everybody has lots of things to ask her, since her work is so compelling and so endlessly relevant. The Visiting Filmmaker series at George Mason has been bringing films and filmmakers to campus pretty regularly since 2010, so it's a long time. Our first event was actually in 1995 when we brought Cheryl Denier. Some of you may know her. She's now working on Ava DuVernay's show on TV. We have been fortunate to bring a variety of work and artists to campus. I'm sorry, I'm reading this, I'm looking off. Been fortunate to bring a variety of work and artists to campus, and I invite you to look at our website, which is vfs.gmu.edu. Some of you saw that already to get on here. This semester, we're moving the series online, given the state of our world. And for the month of April, we have an amazing array of people coming every week. This is thanks to the incredible efforts of Sam Beach, Abby Akam. I'm sorry, Abby, how do I say your last name?
Fine, thank you.
No, how do I say your last name?
Akami.
Akami, thank you. Abby Akami, Andrew Jorgensen, who's our tech today, and Nicole Clavel, along with our many guests and hosts who are Film and Mason faculty members who have a lot to do, and they are joining this effort to bring this content to the planet. The Visiting Filmmakers series online is sponsored by Film and Video Studies, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the College of Visual and Performing Arts, the English Department, the School of Art, Global Affairs and Global Programs, CVPA's Criticos series, Arts and Context, the University Libraries, Film and Media Studies, the Interdisciplinary Curriculum Committee, History and Art History, University Life, and Women and Gender Studies. So thank you very much for coming. I'm going to say a couple of words about Jennifer. Many of you probably know something about her since you're here. She was born in Montreal and grew up in Victoria, British Columbia. She studied philosophy and theology at McGill University and received her MA in 1994, where she was supported by a McGill Major Fellowship and an AFCAR Master's Scholarship. I was actually probably at McGill at that time. I was going to music scholarship conferences, and I think there was one there. There were probably more than one.
Each other on the
Yeah. She has been directing and producing documentaries for 25 years, among other films, installations, and lens-based projects. She has made 10 feature documentaries, which have appeared all over the world and have won multiple awards nationally and internationally. And we have on the website where you joined this conversation, there's a list of, or there's a link to see that list. Her work, including the films and artwork made with her partner, Nicholas Depinskier, and also Edward Bertinsky, who is the subject of the documentary Manufactured Landscapes, which was one of the first films that I saw of hers, which just won me over right away. And I was so impressed, and I've been wanting to bring her to campus since an act of God. But obviously, we were fortunate enough to have her agree to come this semester, and now we're fortunate enough to have her appear before us magically. But her work is ambitious and complex, gorgeous, contemplative and compelling, as well as provocative in, I think, all the best ways. So I want to ask her to speak a little bit about certainly Anthropocene, the human epic, which we made available online. I'm hoping that other people know other work. I know that I was speaking with my sister who lives in Italy, and she had seen the installation in Bologna for the Anthropocene project. So I know that I also wanted at some point to talk about sort of the multifaceted, not only the film work. But I want to start with it's just kind of the corny way to do it, but you've done many fascinating interviews, and one of them was for Sundance a couple of years ago, maybe last year. And one of the things that you said was you have to look to the margins to eliminate the center. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that as a philosophy, and I'm going to turn off my sound while my dog barks.
Okay. Thank you for having me, Cynthia and George Mason. And I wish I could be there in person, but this is the next best thing. And Andrew, will you chime in if something weird happens to my audio or my video?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're fine.
Okay, good. So I'm very happy to be here. And I just, I mean, it's an interesting thing because I think about it a lot, and it's something that I'd love to talk about also, the ethics engagement in documentary practice. And I think just going back on a personal note, my background, my father is from India and my mother is British, and they met when she was training to be a nurse in London, and he was doing postgraduate work at a hospital as a doctor, and he came from a very small town in the south. And I'm saying this because my whole life I've felt somewhat marginal. We have no real collective identity as a family because of the fact that we come from this cross-cultural background. And when they got married, it caused a lot of problems at the time, and both families sort of disowned them for doing it. And so that marginality that I've kind of felt for a long time was sort of a curse. I really is crucial to the way that I work as a filmmaker, because I think that that idea of illuminating from the edges or finding the voice that is actually crucial to understanding something or some place, but a voice that normally would be overlooked. I think about Watermark, and a perfect example of that is Donna Innocencia, who is a member of the Kukapa Nation. We went to the Colorado River Delta, which was dry, to show that because of all the damming of the Colorado, the water no longer reaches the Delta. And you know, in most, I'm not going to say most, but in a traditional documentary, you would have an expert there, a water expert who would be, you know, standing in the Delta, telling you what you're looking at, explaining the fact of what happens when the Delta is dry. And it was very important to me that the person who tells us about that place should be the person who is of it. Her nation has been completely decimated by the damming of the Colorado River to the point where there's hardly anybody left. It was traditionally a fishing community, and she's one of the only ones still there. And she would be either sort of added for color or overlooked as the principal voice of that place. And yet for me, it was absolutely crucial that she was the principal voice of that place. And so that's, I guess, what I mean by illuminating the center from what people would consider to be the margin. And it kind of came out of feeling like that for most of my life when I was younger, and then realizing, wow, this is actually a very fruitful way of looking at the world.
Yeah, I would actually mention. I'm going to cut off my sound for a second. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
I can hear myself. I don't know why. I imagine actually that experience is fairly common for a lot of the people who would watch your films as well. And that it's probably fairly, it helps them to understand or help them to identify with who's on screen, right? Because they've experienced it themselves. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about the form of this particular film, which I think is, well, all of your work is sort of has been evolving, I think, along these lines, but the way that you were able to um, sort of integrate what we understand as sort of broad categories of science and art, and people tend to think of those as separate, although I don't imagine that they are, and sort of how you are able to bring them together in the filmmaking or in the sort of the projects that you present. And we can think about films as well as the installations and the photography as well.
Yeah, well, why don't I just step back and talk a bit about what Anthropocene was, like, and how it started, which was actually Ed and I were in Washington, D.C. for the release of Watermark, and we were walking along, you know, about to go to the theater, and he said, should we do another project together? And I said, what about the At that point, that was kind of true. It was something that was one of those, if you did a poll, which we used to do in theaters or among friends or gatherings, it would be at the most 2 to 5% of people who understood that word. And as I did and started to do more and more research into the work of the Anthropocene Working Group, and Ed's first response to that was, that's a terrible idea. No, nobody can even say that word, let alone know what it means. But when we first started to do the work, I realized I wanted to talk about the fact that, or express the fact that everything comes from, all of the inspiration comes from the scientists and their research. And yet, unfortunately, when, you know, they just published a book last year at Cambridge University Press about all of their research, and it's incredibly dense, and it's the kind of thing that most normal people will never read. And so our idea from the very beginning was, how do we translate this work into a medium that is accessible for ordinary people? And how do we disciplinarity is perhaps the way of the future, that you know, if we're going to solve these huge problems that we have created, it is only through those illuminations from the margins or unexpected intersections that we will actually, I think, be able to find creative ways to respond to the situation that we're in. So all of the categories of research in the film were, as we researched for the film, were the categories of research of the scientists. And we stuck very closely to the science, but we tried to find the most iconic examples of all of these things that they were doing, you know, anthroturbation, human tunneling under the earth, technofossils, the debris that humans leave behind, et cetera, et cetera. What are ways of conveying this in a visceral and experiential and emotional and intellectual way all at the same time? And so we spent about a year doing that research, trying to find those places that expressed the scientists' work. And then we spent another year trying to get access to these places, which was sometimes the hardest part about what we did, was getting access. And then we sort of branched off into all of these different iterations of lens-based media as a way of promoting experiential understanding. So there was the film, there was Ed's photographs, there were film installations, video installations that went into the museum show. There were 360 VR films that are now part of this online Anthropocene curriculum that we are sharing throughout Canada, and that hopefully into the States and around the world. There were AR, augmented reality sculptures, virtual sculptures that we were shooting at the same time. So literally, we were doing all of these things on location at the same time, knowing that we were preparing for the museum exhibition, knowing we were preparing for the education curriculum, knowing that there was going to be a book, and knowing that there was going to be a film. And so that's sort of how the whole 5-year project unfolded.
I have to sort of ask, like, what possessed you to think of all those things at the same time? And it's certainly just taking on one of those
I know.
aspects.
It was crazy. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure why we did it. It's the biggest, sort of most ambitious thing that any of us have done. And I think part of it was a desire to bring, like, one thing that I really tried to do in manufactured landscapes and thought about from the very beginning, and I had many discussions with Peter Mettler, who was the cinematographer, and of course Nick, who produced that film, about how to intelligently translate one medium into another. How do you intelligently translate photography into the time-based medium of film? And it seemed to me from the beginning that just showing the photographs would be a failure, and also capitulating to biography or would be a failure. I wanted to try to extend the meaning of the photographs into the medium of film. And what I realized that meant was very much a constant dialectic of scale and detail. Ed, as a photographer, thinks at scale. He thinks of the big picture. He thinks of the one place you need to stand in order to convey a place, the whole of a place. What film can do is make forays into all the potential little narrative details that are happening in that big view. And in a way, it is only those details that make the big picture meaningful. If you stay up high all the time, and interestingly, there's a lot of critique of Anthropocene representations that are aerial, like you're hovering in the sky, the kind of omniscient God's eye view, the diagrammatic view of a place, that has become a kind of default way of depicting the Anthropocene, satellite imagery, for example. And I feel that the only way that it works, both to convey the understanding, to convey the truth of the place, but also ethically, is with that dialectic of scale and detail. So the idea of the museum exhibition was to try to take what was happening in the films into the exhibition context, because both for Manufactured Landscapes and Watermark, there were exhibitions that happened simultaneously when the film was being released, but they were all photography. They were Ed's photographs, and that was great. So we thought, what would happen if we tried to collaborate in the museum context as well? And that's how that all sort of came about.
Thank you. Can we talk a little bit also about content? Certainly the content of this film at this point in time seems increasingly pressing, human effects on the planet. So I can imagine how this evolved out of your previous work and sort of the trajectory that was taking, but can you talk a little bit about that decision as to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about COVID-19, we're really talking about a very anthropogenic thing that is happening, that is hastened by our global reality now. And so for us, the importance of, I mean, some people could argue that who cares if the Anthropocene is ratified as an official geological epoch? Like, only a handful of geologists are going to care about that. And in a way, that's true. So the attempt to actually have it ratified as an epoch, so we are technically in the Holocene epoch right now for the past 12,000 years since the last ice age receded. And these scientists are arguing that we have left the Holocene and we are in the Anthropocene now because of the fact that humans change the systems of the earth more than all natural processes combined. So that was sort of our starting point, and trying to think about how to express that the magnitude of that. You know, as a species, we haven't been around for very long, but we sure have had a massive impact on the way that the planet works. How do we show that? But also, how do we show that in a way that invites viewers to contemplate their own relationship to places they're connected to or responsible for, but would never normally see? And I think that non-didactic, experiential way that we have really done in almost all of our films, but particularly in these three that we've collaborated on with Ed Bertinsky, was trying to be sort of revelatory rather than accusatory. So in Anthropocene, we went to Norilsk, which is 320 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. It's in Siberia. It's closed even to ordinary Russians. You have to get a special permit to go there. Colored metal mine in the world. But the largest source of the world's palladium comes from Norilsk. And so the chances are that the palladium in my cell phone or even in my computer, the one that I'm talking on right now, came from Norilsk. And so it's finding those moments of, wow, I am connected to this place, and sort of trying to allow viewers to participate in these landscapes that they would not normally see. And they're in some cases, devastating landscapes. When you go to Hambach mine, the largest open pit coal mine in Germany, it's a pretty heavy duty place with the biggest land machine on the planet, the bagger. And yet, what is important to sort of recognize, going back to human impact, and your comment and question there, is that these are not extraordinary landscapes. These are business as usual landscapes. These places are operating often 24 hours a day, and they are all sort of necessary, I suppose we can call it. They're all supporting the lives of everybody who lives on the planet, particularly people in the global north who live in urban centers, who, like me. And when you think, oh, I'm going into nature, I'm making a foray into nature, I'm going for a walk in a park or a canoe or something like that, we think of nature as separate from us, and yet we are partaking of nature in every single thing we do every single day, every gesture we make in the city. And that disconnection is also something that we were trying to repair in some way.
Thank you. Nate, you asked a really good question. Do you want me to ask? Do you want to ask it yourself? Do you want me to read it?
I can read it. I didn't know which format was best to convey it, but I can read it as well. So what I wrote was, you've spoken of using a variety of different media to convey a unified message with your Anthropocene project. So you spoke of using like museums and exhibits and films and just a wide array of different approaches to conveying your message to an audience. Do you feel like one was most influential? And if so, or if not, why would that be?
Oh, that is a good question. Well, you know, I am at heart a filmmaker, so of course I think the film is the most important expression. Mostly because, I mean, the capacity for sustained reflection, as we know, although I guess most of us home now and quarantined or trying to stay home as much as possible, maybe that is ebbing back. But the capacity for sustained reflection is it's becoming smaller and smaller, and the opportunities for it are becoming rarer and rarer. And so there's something about an extended time, 90 minutes of sustained reflection following a thread or a series of threads that I find really compelling. And I think when you're in the museum exhibition, it's added, like there's a spatial element to it. You're walking through space with all of these, the space of all of these different expressions, and that's very powerful too. But there's something about submitting to that stream that I still find, the most compelling. Why I probably still make films and want to make films, because I think it's a very powerful medium. Oops.
Okay, it sounds like my my can't get my headphones to work. Sorry. Okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just I'm hearing myself twice, which is part of the thing. Okay.
Maybe take your headphones out and just use the speaker on your
See if
computer.
that works.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh, I see. Okay. All right, I will try it this way. All right, I'll try that. Thank you. All right. Anybody else have a question they want to ask right now, or should I ask another?
I have a question.
Thank you. I'm gonna get my dog.
Hey, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm curious about just going back to content. Um, I see the whole concept is kind of challenging for traditional nation, and I'm curious what you think about that. I read a book by E.O. Wilson called Half Earth, and he sort of rails against this idea of the Anthropocene because of what it means in terms of conservation to him. So for me, I'm particularly interested in migrations, like plant migrations and human migrations, and particularly about how conservation has sort of handled and labeled invasive species and that's relationship. There's a lot of species that migrating as a result of climate change. So I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on that whole debate, I guess.
Well, the half-Earth debate is a really interesting one, and I mean, one of the things that we were considering as a subject was invasive species, because people talk about that as a sign of the Anthropocene. And let's just step back for a bit and acknowledge that there are numerous critiques of the Anthropocene concept, and they're all really interesting. And so our exploration in this film is not to bang the drum for it, but to explore the ideas behind the science of it. And, there are critiques from a feminist perspective, from an economic or political perspective. Some people argue that Anthropocene should be called Capitalocene because, of course, there's a very small number of people and also transnational corporations that are responsible for most of the damage. There are indigenous critiques. It goes on, and it's even from an archaeological perspective. A conservative archaeologist, a conservative geologist would say the evidence is not in the rocks yet. It has to be lithified in order to be really, a geological epoch. And a lot of these other scientists who are part of the group, and that is archaeologists, biologists, earth system scientists as well, would argue that the strata is there. They would argue that landfill is strata. It's already, you just go to a garbage dump and you can look at technofossil strata. So there are a lot of different, I think the biggest critique, or the one that is driven home the most to me, is that we talk about it as though it is a universal concept, that humans as a species have had this impact, and yet there are so many people living with the effects of the acts of a few. So I agree with the certainly the indigenous and the feminist and the political critique. But in terms of invasive species, which is so interesting because we went down this path and we were looking at different species, the way that they come in, globalization, New Zealand that is trying to have these zones that have no invasive species at all. So what does it look like? What was the pristine environment? And it became quite clear actually that it was ever thus in some way. It just happened slower before globalization, before big ships started going into ports from halfway around the world and people started flying everywhere. It was still happening. It just wasn't as accelerated. And so I think from that perspective, we decided also because the scientists did not really have it as one of their research categories, not to pursue invasive species and the idea of these migrations. I mean, it's inevitable. How we I don't think it's something that we can stop, and I think it's somewhat, I mean, maybe this is a wrong thing to say. It's almost quaint to try to stop it now, given, you know, to protect what is considered to be real or of that place, and keep out things that are not of that place. I think, you know, you can argue that people are trying to do that with migration everywhere, and I think it's not a uh, I think it's a lost cause. So we might as well accept that fact.
Thank you.
It also seems that it's not. It also seems that it's really the case that when it was moving more slowly, that it was damaged, that it was more sort of, you know, evolution or working together, you know, people sort of interacting with the earth. But now that it has accelerated, now it feels like damage. I mean, is there a difference between change and damage, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that's something for everybody to think about. I don't know the answer to that. You can look at this virus and say that's precisely what is happening. The way that it is moved before community transmission was very much about people going. I mean, trying to stop people from moving around. I mean, I'm fascinated by the environmental effects of this crisis and how, you know, what CO2 levels down in China, et cetera, and it makes you wonder whether there is going to be some kind of, is this just a respite? Is this how we should mostly be living all the time? This idea of emergency has finally been driven home, but it's been driven home this way, and to many people, still climate change is abstract enough, or not connected to the realities of weather, you know, that they face, that they're not responding to it in the same way.
Okay, does somebody else have a question you want to ask? I have another one. Can you talk a little bit about sort of being a woman filmmaker? This is something that comes up a lot here at George Mason among our student body. I'm wondering sort of what your experience has been and how you think about it and how you deal with it.
So, two things there. I'll answer that in two parts. And the first is, might seem attenuated, but it's about the ethics of engagement. Like, my background is in philosophy and religious studies, and I turned to film kind of as a way of exploring those subjects, again, in a way that was accessible to people. I was going on my way to become an academic, and I thought, you know, how many people are actually going to read my master's thesis? Two or three, the outside reader, myself, and my advisor, you know. And so I kind of thought, is there another way of exploring these big questions, these questions of the human condition? And that's how I started working in film. I'm self-taught. I didn't go to film school. I just started doing it, and I learned by doing it. And interestingly, Nick is exactly the same. He was a gaffer. Well, before he was a gaffer, he was a driver. He was a PA on big film sets. Then he became an assistant gaffer, then a gaffer, and then he started, you know, helping people with the camera. And meanwhile, he was shooting, you know, independent dance films because all of his friends were dancers, and he was making them and editing them and directing them himself. And so I never thought about what it was to be. Think from the very beginning that the only way, especially with us, you know, we go all over the world for our films, and it's an incredibly arrogant thing to do, to shove a camera in somebody's face. And there always is, as we know, the triangle of power, and the subject is usually at the bottom and the viewer and the filmmaker at the top. And the only way that I think it's sort of possible to engage authentically in these contexts that you are not of is with extreme humility, and also an openness to not being in control. It's a constant relinquishing of control rather than, asserting control. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a scary thing to do sometimes when you're in, a chaotic situation, when you're spending a lot of money. The default is to kind of think, maybe you should. The default is to say, no, we're doing this. We need these shots. We've got to get this right. And yet the reality is, it is the opposite of that. It is submitting to the situation and the context, and being able to, in that way, kind of understand the truth of that place, and then understand how to convey it. And I sometimes wonder if that is, and I'll probably open myself up to critique, and maybe it's true, if that's a kind of female thing, because wherever we go on, and I go everywhere, nobody ever thinks that I'm in charge, and usually the crew is mostly guys, and then when after a while they sort of understand that I am not there to whatever take care of the men or do some menial position, their attitude changes slightly, and I think that I've noticed that. But I will also say that I have never worked for another company. I've been an independent filmmaker for 25 years. Nick and I have our own company. We do bespoke films kind of one at a time. And the reason I've never worked for anybody else, and I've been asked often, oh, come and do a couple of series here, or do some episodes for us, or can you come and be a director for hire? The only time we ever did that was with the National Film Board, with the film Payback that we made of Margaret Atwood's Massey lectures. And that was a very, they were great, but it was hard because we weren't in control. And I think one of the reasons that I have always been an independent is so that I don't have to deal with the crap that I would have to deal with as a woman in this industry if I was rising through the ranks. So that's my thought. The numbers are still quite pathetic in terms of female representation in our industry. Interestingly, in documentary, it's more equitable. It's like 40-60 or something. And I think that's because documentary have small crews and small budgets, and you're often doing everything yourself anyway. So maybe the stakes aren't quite so high. But I believe that in order for those numbers to shift somehow, and I'm an advocate of Share Her Journey. I'm on the board of the Toronto Film Festival, and Share Her Journey is our initiative to get more women in front of and behind the camera. And I think the only way that is going to happen is when more women get involved. It's like a numbers game where things start to shift and tip, so that the business as usual model, where people are responding to, they hire people like them, that will change, and there will be an influx in some way.
That's very good.
That's very good.
Because my sound
is
bothering me, I'm not really sure how to proceed, but I will say also that I feel that way actually in the classroom on a much smaller scale, but it's sort of like giving over control, or just relinquishing and letting, learning from the group at the same time that you're actually, sort of trying to guide it or lead it. So I'm heartened to hear that. Mohammed has a really good question. Do you want to ask it yourself, Mohammed, or do you want me to ask it?
Sure. No worries. I can ask it myself. First of all, hi, my name is Mohammed. I want to ask you, do you think if you went to a film school, would that make you a better filmmaker in any way? Maybe in connections, not only artistically, or like in any way, just in general. Thank you.
You know, undoubtedly, it would have made me better at understanding lenses and cameras and the more technical aspects of it. And maybe, I mean, I teach film now. I mean, I do it. I've taught classes. I teach a graduate class at York University occasionally, a documentary production class. And one of the first things that I always say to students is, don't think anybody can tell you how to make a film, because they can't. There's no way, there's no technique that you need to learn, or a secret formula or something. And also conversely, don't let anybody tell you how not to make a film. I mean, I really think that one thing that I may have gained from not going through a formal education process was not being afraid to make mistakes, and also not being afraid to explore everything. You know, I didn't feel constrained. Is the most beautiful thing about film school is I mean, most people have their own equipment, but access to resources, number one, huge. I mean, I'm not doing these in order, but access to resources is huge for a lot of people. Not everybody has, you know, a home edit system and their own camera. You know, you can make a film with almost anything now, but access to resources. And your peers, like your peers are the people who you end up, your cohort that you move through the world with. And the students that I taught, you know, during manufactured landscapes, just before we went to China, that class was the only undergraduate class I've ever taught. They're all working with each other now. They're editors and cinematographers and directors, and they still work together. And I find that so wonderful, so gratifying that that's their group. So having peers in a cohort is crucial. I didn't have that. I wish I had that. Now I have a documentary community. It's not a big community in Canada, but it's a tight one. And we've been working with the same people in our, you know, the same editors, the same sound people, the same post-production people for 15 years now. And so that feels like community for sure. The other aspect of it is mentors, like the you know, and this goes back to the male thing, because there's a lot of I don't mind being considered a mentor. I never want to be considered some kind of sage on the stage teacher that's going to, the pearls of wisdom are going to come down and this is how you have to do it. That's crap. Like, and believe me, there's a lot of people who like to be the sage on the stage. And I just think that if you can find a real mentor, you know, it's a huge part of learning. And I mean somebody who really is a mentor, not somebody who abuses their position of influence or power to belittle you or make you feel indebted, but somebody who really has your best interests and the best interests of your growth as a creative person and a filmmaker at heart. So those are things that I think come from an academic environment that would have been I found them outside of that. It might have been easier to find them if I'd have stayed, if I'd have gone to film school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Daniel, you had a question too. Do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask it for you?
Yeah, I can ask it.
Thanks.
So I was interested in your background as an academic. Personally, I think of myself more of a student than a filmmaker at this point. I'm in my second year at the school. So I was just wondering, how do you make the transition from being an academic student to being a person who makes films?
Well, it was I applied for a grant from the Canada Council, which is kind of our national arts council here in Canada. And they used to have this program called the Explorations Program, which meant that you could apply, not for a lot of money, but for money at having no experience in that field. Most grants go to, you know, artists or people who have, you know, a track record. This required none of that. And I thought, wow, why don't I try to make a film about the problem of personal identity. It was a short film called Looking You in the Back of the Head that was an interview with all of these different women, asking them to try to describe themselves. And the whole point was that they can't. And that film was like my school. I got the grant, so I was happy about that. And I worked with a friend of mine who was studying film at Concordia University. And so she was the cinematographer and co-producer. And that film was like my school. I made so many mistakes. Like, we edited with 2 consumer VHS machines and VHS tapes with no time code. And these were long interviews, just kind of, I think she said that there, going back and doing our own transcriptions. And I learned how to interview in that film. I learned how to edit. I learned how to shoot, the idea of framing, like all of these things came up making that film. And I think it was such a gift that I got to be able to do that without, jumping through a whole bunch of hoops. And I as soon as I started shooting, it was in Montreal, and I was on our second day. We were in a market filming, and I thought, wow, I found my vocation. I found the thing that I really want to do, that I want to do for the rest of my career. And so that's how it started. And simultaneously, we were making a film on the writer Paul Bowles called Let It Come Down. And many years ago, when I was supposed to be in university, I ran away to Morocco to meet Paul Bowles. And I ended up living there for a year and sort of, becoming friends with him. And 10 years after that, I went back to make this film about him. He agreed to be interviewed. He was quite a recluse at that point, but that film that Nick and I made together over the course of about 7 or 8 years, because we had to keep putting our own money into it, it was self-financed, was, when we finally finished it, we released it on 16mm film. Like, that was when they still had those projectors in the theater with the crappy 16mm sound. But we submitted to the Toronto Film Festival and we got in. And from that, this is kind of a funny, it's a dumb story, but it was the first time that our national newspaper was printing in color. It was their first edition, and we did an interview with a writer who asked us about the project and everything, and we sent in some photographs, and we found that we were on the front page of the art section, this huge color picture of us struggling in the desert to go up a sand dune. And it created all this attention around the film, and we got a distribution deal in Canada and Japan and in the United States. And then the film went on to win an international Emmy. And I think that it was that film that kind of launched us in a way and allowed us to get financing to make other films, because people thought that we knew what we were doing. So it was kind of lucky that happened to us at that time.
I love that idea of the sort of happy accident, like that sort of led to all of what followed. I actually had a question that is sort of building on what you just said, and that is when you were talking about learning to interview and learning to edit, they seem to be sort of a piece in your films, because the interviews don't necessarily sound like interviews, regular talking head interviews, and they're integrated into the fabrics of the films, which is a function of your editing, obviously. So I wanted to ask you sort of how you think about that process, like when you are interviewing people, obviously you have to spend time sort of developing a relationship with them, and then how do you then sort of transfer at least a part of that relationship into the film?
Yeah, so part of that the ethic of relinquishing control and humility, being humble, is also about what are those ethics of engagement. And I really feel as though there's 2 parts to that. We never work with the script, because I think that the script tries to sort of predict what is going to happen, and in reality, you never know what's going to happen. So my sort of one-line philosophy is have a plan, but be ready to abandon it at any moment. Because if you work without a plan, what you're doing is arbitrary, and that's just too broad. But if you have too rigid a plan, you don't see what is happening around you. And the whole point of being in a place is to be aware of what is happening around you. So because we don't have a script, we do tons of shooting. Our shooting ratios are very high, like 300, 350 to 1. So I'm sifting through between 400 and 500 hours of material, often in the edit room with the editor to make our films. And that seems terribly inefficient, but it's actually deliberate, because in order to be quiet enough or to be in a place enough to know it, you need to shoot a lot. And that also goes for interviewing. There has to be an authentic exchange of vulnerability between you and the person you're interacting with. And that goes back to this triangle of power. It's just not possible to it's not possible from an ethical standpoint and from a standpoint of actually knowing somebody, trying to know somebody in the medium of film, the relatively cold medium of film, without that thing happening. And it's not something you can do sort of as a technique or deliberately, where you're, I'll tell you something about myself, so then you just reveal yourself to me. It doesn't work like that. It has to be real. It requires time and investment, and it requires some kind of real, authentic relationship. And so often our interviews are quite long, and I never ask anybody to do something for the camera like that. That's just, maybe I take it too far, that idea of interfering in what is happening. I don't believe in objectivity. I know that that's not possible, but I still think truth is possible. And some kind of conveying of truth. And how do you do that except through ethics and humility? But I will never say to somebody, oh, can you just include my question in your answer? I never want anyone to think that they're being interviewed, because then they immediately become uncomfortable. It needs to be a conversation. With Paul Bowles, we did an almost 30-hour interview when he was dying in bed in Tangier. And we literally propped a boom pole up in a pile of sweaters, and Nick sat with the camera. That's when we were still shooting 60mm, but we shot the interviews on video. This was Betacam, and I was sitting right beside him. And every day we went to see him for 10 days. And we did this interview over 3 hours, and we'd stop and have tea, and he would start to smoke keef and get a little silly towards the end of it. But that at the end of it, and in fact, the end, when we ran out of tape, was the last thing he said, and it ended up being the end of the film as well. But he said, I didn't even know when the camera was on, because we just had this conversation about his life. And we walked through his whole life and everything that had happened to him. And so it's not actually a conversation, because I'm not interrupting him when he's talking, and I'm giving nonverbal cues instead of verbal cues. So I'm aware that it's not a conversation, but it's very important to me that it feels like that for the subject and or the person that you're talking to. And I mean, in order to do that kind of interviewing, you need to do an enormous amount of research so that you feel comfortable moving from place to place, and you're not always looking down at your notes. When people interview me and they do that, and they ask me a question and I answer it, and then they look down and they ask the next question like it's, but they're not listening to what I'm saying. They're just listening in order to ask the question again. It makes you incredibly uncomfortable. So it really has to be like that. It has to be a real conversation. And then the edit process, which takes us normally about a year. Roland Schlimm is the editor for many years. And that just becomes this process of sifting through all the footage, like making a 5,000 word puzzle without ever looking at what the picture is that it is supposed to look like at the end. And it's like a kind of sleuthing mystery story, and it's my favorite part of the process, because you end up, your allegiance to what happened in the field, like when you're in production, my memory of something, I'll say, where's that bird that was up in the tree, beside the mine, that kept, squawking away. And of course he didn't film that, I just remember it. So my allegiance to my memory of what was there shifts to the universe of the footage, and the footage becomes the sort of locus of this exploration to try to find the story.
Mhm. There's so much about that. Partly it sounds like, or as I'm thinking about it, memory in film and in art, photography becomes sort of a collective process. Like, this is how we remember history, is when we have images of it or somebody's written it down, and the old story that the victors are the ones who get to write the history anyway. So that's an interesting sort of combination, or a kind of a set of parallel tracks, that we each have our own memories of the experience, but then there's also like what you filmed and what what was in frame at that time, or what was captured by the sound. So that's very interesting to sort of think about as you're making films. The other part of it is, and this is a question I know you've been asked before, but the sort of question of sort of how you choose the images that you're using in a way that might complicate how people are reading, meaning that there's beauty and there's something that's ugly that's happening, and how do you sort of grapple with that sort of critique, or that worry that you're making something that's difficult or ugly into beautiful art?
Well, I'm sure that Mark thinks about that in that class, and it's kind of an interesting. We always get asked, and Ed often gets asked, why do you make terrible things look so beautiful? And for us, it's more, we often get the critique of not sounding the alarm strongly enough, not being strident enough. And we have a lot of friends who are activist filmmakers who do work that is very much with the intention of a particular outcome, of educating people and then showing them where they can go to act. And I think all of that work is incredibly powerful. I think polemic is powerful in this field of environmental filmmaking. On the other hand, there is something about the bigger tent, the bigger group of people, instead of just sort of communicating with people who agree with you and those who will turn away if they disagree. There is something about the aesthetic relationship that can draw people in to a more complex dialogue than if it's something that they look at and it's horrific and they just turn away. And I think in Ed's case, he's accused of the ambiguity of the fact that his photographs can hang in the boardroom of a corporation and then in the environmentalist's office who is fighting against that corporation. And most people would feel as though that ambiguity is intolerable. And yet I think that is the heart of the power of his work, that ambiguity, that complexity, because when you look at those photographs, I mean, the first photograph I ever saw of Ed's was, I thought it was an abstract painting from across the room, and I walked closer to it and realized I was looking at densified oil filters. And then I kind of recoiled in horror, like, oh, that's garbage. And then I realized that garbage was my own garbage. And so that process of realization happened through a kind of aesthetic seduction. I think in the films, it's a little bit different in that there is an absolutely deliberate attempt to not be didactic, to not hammer things home, to not accuse, but to allow people to come to conclusions on their own through being able to be in these environments that they are connected to but would never normally see, as I said before. And somehow that process of transformation, of shifting of consciousness, I think can be more powerful when people do it themselves. And so rather than being told, oh, this is what you should do, this is wrong, this is right. And the aesthetic relationship there is very important, as well as the kind of destabilization of the viewer. When you first are introduced to the bagger, you don't know what you're looking at. You just see these huge things scooping up earth, you know, and then it sort of telescopes out until you see how big this machine actually is. And then you see eventually and how big it is. And so that destabilization of not quite knowing what you're looking at is also a way of, I think, drawing people into a more profound attention and reflection. But we do get criticized for it, and it's, you know, I hope. I mean, I think one of the things that I sort of lie awake at night and worry about is that, was the energy expenditure of the project worth the number of people that we might reach in some way through this project? Because we certainly expended a lot of energy. I mean, and carbon. The whole project is carbon offset. That includes the museum show, the film, the books, etc. But that's not quite enough. So I think about that often. Is it worth it? Like somebody asked a Buddhist monk, what can I do to save the planet? And he said, go to sleep. So, you know, this is the opposite of that, I suppose.
Yeah, when you're talking about that, it reminded me of that. I mean, there are many moments in Anthropocene where that happens, but with the backhoe, like, comes in over the top of we're looking at a frame, and all of a sudden it just comes into the frame. You feel like it's, you know, sort of intruding into the image.
A monster.
Nate has another question that I'm going to ask him to ask.
Yes. Hello again. So when I've tried to like forego into small form documentary work, I feel this immense pressure of doing due diligence to the subject, and I feel like they're putting themselves out there in a very exposed way that I haven't seen in fictional work that I've worked on or seen otherwise. So how do you handle that responsibility of the people that you're working with as subjects in your films?
Well, as I mentioned, the authentic exchange is absolutely necessary, but you know, I'm always, there's often a point at which empathy becomes voyeurism with viewers, or something where it shifts and the viewer is no longer empathetic to the person that they're watching, but they become an outsider in some way. And I really try to never let that happen. I think that my job, even to people who I don't agree with, is to be kind and to be fair, and really to try to, just like trying to find the truth in a particular context, trying to really convey what this person has to say. And that ethics has to be top of mind all the time when you're talking to somebody. And I think when it doesn't, when people don't do that, and I was just thinking about Tiger King because my son is watching that, and you know, it's so funny and it's great, and yet it's a downward gaze and it bugs me. Like I can't watch it without, I watched 2 episodes of it, and I got everything about it that was so good and entertaining and all of that. And yet those techniques of, you know, when people turn the camera on and people are fixing their hair still and everything, and but then they leave it. I think that's so mean. I would never do that. But also just, it is a downward gaze. And so when you watch it as a viewer, you're participating in that somehow, in that downward by being entertained by it. Now, I'm probably overstating it, because in the end, you know, these are people who want to reach people. They're interested in attention. So probably there is an exchange there that I am not taking into account when I bring this up. But I think, to me, my responsibility as a filmmaker is to never exploit in that way, and to really be careful about those lines, those ethical lines, at all times. Oops.
Thank you. Do we have another question? I have a question I can ask having to do with that. And that is sort of combining the idea of the downward gaze and trying not to be didactic. I think there's so much instruction and so much information that is conveyed in your films that certainly doesn't feel like we're being instructed, but there are points where we're learning vocabulary, or we're learning how things are connected, or you know, there's certainly we're learning about other people's experiences. So there is that level of sort of instruction going on. So how do you sort of manage that as an aesthetic and formal, but also a kind of an emotional experience? I mean, it is on some level you are managing your viewers, right? At the same time, you're allowing them to have their own experiences, but how are you sort of like shaping that experience for them?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's hard information in the Anthropocene and in the research categories of the scientists of the Anthropocene Working Group, and part of, from the very beginning, we were grappling with, how do we convey that information? There's vocabulary there that people, you just don't know what those words mean, and it was a real challenge to give enough contextual information so you knew what you were looking at and why you were looking at it eventually, without being told what to think about it. And so originally we were going to have just text cards. So the text cards that exist in the film of the categories, we're also going to have the definition of those categories. And then statistics that are kind of interesting, like humans move more sediment than all the rivers of the world combined. Like, that's crazy. That's a crazy thing. How do you convey that? And so we started to put text in, and it just became too busy. The frame became too busy. Then you think, am I going to go to black every time I do that? Am I going to actually put text over imagery? And we worked so hard to get these very high resolution, this high resolution imagery. We work with, you know, state of the art cameras always. Like Watermark was the first time, I think, not maybe the first time, but one of the first times that anybody had used a drone before. We found the person making them in Seattle, and they came with us to China. So we're always trying to push the limits of the technology to overlay it all with text, which was not working. So it wasn't until about month 8 that I realized, you know what, I'm going to start writing narration and see how that works. And it was, again, that thing of, I'm writing, I have to take out anything that is superfluous, but keep enough in that people can do that thing, know what they're looking at and why, and that's it. And so the process of writing took 2 or 3 months, and then it was this question of, are we going to have a narrator? And I've always resisted, the voice of God narration, because it felt like a crutch, and it also felt like it relegated visual language to a subordinate role. And from the very beginning, even in that first film I made about women and identity, I wanted the relationship between visual language and text to be organic and fluid, and for each to inform the other, not for one to be dominant. And it's something that I've often said to students who, they're making a documentary, they're trying to cover, cuts in interviews, and they have the most banal cutaways, like, somebody opening a fridge. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any metaphorical meaning or relationship. So why are we looking at that? Why are we looking at that? It doesn't make sense. Or when visual language is completely relational. So you'll say, well, he grew up in this house, and then you cut to that house. It makes people lazy, or it makes it's just not an interesting relationship, and it happens so often in more, I would say, journalistic or news work. So wrote the narration and then realized, okay, the last thing I want is for a man to narrate this, because the voice of God is always a man. You know, and so I thought about what actors do we like, respect, whose voices we like, and also who are environmentally conscious. And Alicia Vikander was at the top of the list. And I've never had to deal with agents before or anything like that, because we just don't do that kind of work. And it happened so easily that I almost thought, God, I should go into making dramatic films, fiction films, and I'll be able to, you know, we'll work with these big name actors, because it wasn't hard at all. And I realized it was a complete anomaly. She had time, and she did it. And Nick actually had to go to her home where she was living in Spain and film her, and there were no recording studios. So it ended up being these two guys who were brothers who did it in their garage, and you had to walk through, you know, the house and say hi to their mother to use the bathroom and everything. But they did it, and it was 2 days before it was the day before the September long weekend, Labor Day, and then the press screenings were the next day after that. So we were up for 48 hours cutting that in and making sure that it worked.
Your experience with her might have been specific to her too. So not all big name actors and their agents might be quite as easy to work with as she was.
I think I came to that conclusion. It was kind of naive of me, but she was wonderful, and she has such a beautiful voice. And you know what? It's hopeful, because she's young, you know, and so anyway.
Right. Does anybody else have a question you want to ask Jennifer? Okay, I can ask. I have yet another. It has to do with science, just sort of science as a thing and as a belief system, if we think of it that way, or as what is its future? Because it seems like, sort of given, again, sort of our circumstances at the moment, that science is in trouble, just in terms of how people think about it, or not everybody, but certainly a large number of people. So what is your, speaking of hopeful, that sort of was what made me think of it. Are you hopeful for, and how does science sort of part of that hope, I guess?
Well, I am constantly amazed at the humility and the precision of science. Like you know, in film, we're always engaged in these grand gestures, and yet there are people we've met who work on one thing, you know, coral, right, for their whole careers. Coral, the gut microbiota of bees, you know, it's extraordinary to me that you can be in that universe of science. I think science that as a form of truth, the reason that I thought or different disciplines juxtaposing or having juxtaposition in a way that is unexpected might be our way forward, is that I think we've gotten to a place, because of the way information is shared today, and because we have some political leaders who deliberately try to sort of attack truth and science, and where we have transnational corporations that have interests in sowing dissent and uncertainty among the population. we're in a crisis of truth now, and the way that we can move forward, and I think people are witnessing it now with this virus, that we have to trust the science. Look at how many people are in lockdown or in quarantine around the world right now, and it is because science has told us that this is the only way that we can deal with flattening the curve of this pandemic. And I think without that perspective, without the scientific perspective, that, you know, the epidemiological perspective that is really showing us how these things have happened in the past, we would have no idea, because I wouldn't trust anybody else to tell us what to do or to ask us what to do now. My hope comes from, I mean, going to all of these different places around the world, and some of them pretty horrendous environments, and seeing the dignity of the people who live in those environments, just trying to make a living, support their families, you know, the crane operators in Norilsk, or the people living in Dandora landfill, just eking out a living day after day. Their dignity and is an incredible source to me of hope. And not just humans, but other species as well. The way, you know, being in Africa and seeing people working in the conservation areas who are risking their lives for these species at risk, who are finding ways of surviving, that also gives me hope. And also just the every single place we were, I would see that incursion of hope, whether it came from science, whether it came from activism, whether it came from ordinary people, whether it came from a species trying to survive. And I can't forget that. I can't forget those things. And even in my moments of, you know, despair over our future, I remember those moments, and they lift me up, because it makes me feel like we have the capacity to create meaningful change. We just need the collective will to do so.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have another question they want to ask? Otherwise, I think that's kind of an incredible sentiment and sort of sets thoughts. So we might be able to. And is there something else you want to share with us? Do you have an idea that you want to?
Well, I hope that you guys get to go back to school. I hope that this whole situation that we're in globally will somehow, that there could be some things that we learn from it. And I hope, yeah, I feel privileged in the work that I do. And I would never do anything else. I love my work, and I'm able to spend all of this time kind of focusing on one thing. It's like doing a kind of mini PhD, really, every time we make a film on a subject, and being able to, you know, when we go to Venice, we're not walking around St. Mark's Square or whatever. We're going to the flood office, and we're looking at their screens with them, and we're getting a whole a very kind of privileged way of seeing these places. And so I'm tremendously grateful for that. And I think film is a very powerful medium. The combination of sort of text and imagery and sound in time can be very powerful. And I'll just end with this, something that happened in Manufactured Landscapes, because the opening shot of Manufactured Landscapes was very difficult to get, and it came from you know, hours of Peter Metler and I talking about how to convey the scale of this place. And when you look at Ed Bertinsky's photograph of it, it's a diptych. He went up on a lift and he filmed two sides. And that was his way of conveying the scale from above. And we walked that whole place trying to decide, okay, should we go row by row? You know, it was coffee makers, fans, and irons were made in this place, mostly, among other things. Should we go row by row and film row by row? That could have been a whole film. That could have taken, 2 hours to do that. Should we go up on the catwalks and film down? Should we go to the exact same perspective that Ed did when he was filming on the lift and try to find a way of doing it that way? And Peter saw this, the factory floors are very smooth, they're cement. And Peter saw this person delivering something in a golf cart and said, we should do it as a dolly. And I said immediately, if we can pull this off, this is going to be the opening of the film. And it's it took us, we blew through a week's worth of film in one afternoon trying to get this shot. And it was literally Peter and our assistant camera, John Price, on the golf cart with the driver, and me sitting beside Peter, talking to him and looking. It was a super 16 millimeter camera. So talking about what things, look at that guy over there, look at this. Our sound person, Sanjay Mehta, was walking backwards in front of the golf cart with the boom pole, getting all of the sound. And what's interesting about that shot is it's the perfect expression in that moment of scale in time. And when I first showed it to our broadcaster, he said, oh, please don't open with that shot. We're going to lose half the audience of people watching this because they're going to be bored. Can't you jazz it up somehow, like put, subtitles or put the titles there early, or have people's voices, or go do something different. And I said, I'll try to do that. And I went back and I tried to translate these banners that were up, that had these sayings like, come to work happy, go home, come to work healthy, go home happy, things like that. And it actually had the opposite effect. It didn't work. And I realized that what you needed to do as a viewer was be, intrigued at the beginning, you're going along, and then you get kind of bored, and then you get angry, and then you come out of boredom and anger into a recognition of scale. And that was a way of conveying scale in time. And so I said to the broadcaster, sorry, we're using that and we're not putting stuff in. And in the end, he agreed with it. But that I guess is, to me, the power of film. The ability to do something like that in documentary, the power of documentary in particular. And I guess it all started there with Ed. So that is one of my, fondest memories of that film and that shoot.
It's an incredible story, and it speaks to so many different parts. Like standing your ground with your broadcaster, but also sorting through the possibilities, and completely sort of recognizing the relationship between scale and time. I mean, that just seems, we can all think about that. Not even in film.
And it's interesting because it's not a culture of open inquiry. So people were giving these little furtive glances up and then looking down again. And every time I watch that, which is not often, but you can imagine I've seen it a lot of times, I see some new kind of glance, somebody's eye glancing at what are those people doing? Nobody came up and asked us, what are you doing? They just would look and then go back to work. So that was interesting too.
Thank you so much. We appreciate so much that you spent your time with us. And thank you, everybody who's been listening in and asking questions. And stay safe. Thank you all so much. I wish I could have been there in person, maybe with our next film. So take care, all of you. Stay safe, and maybe we'll meet sometime. We hope so. Thank you again. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.